Hey scholars, this is a lecture video for chapter 7 for HCOM 100. Um, so make sure you're looking at the PowerPoint presentation that is available on the same module as you're listening to this video. Um, so this is going to be a lot shorter video than some of the other ones because I'm gonna touch on some things regarding listening, starting with slide 2. So a lot of times people have sort of mistakenly they think of when they think of listening, they think of hearing. Um, but the difference between the two is that hearing is a physiological process of decoding sounds, and listening is an active process. So hearing is just your body's ability to your brain and ears ability to decode sounds that are traveling through sound waves. That's all that hearing is. A lot of times people say things like "You're not hearing me," as though to imply that the other person isn't listening to them. So there's a difference between listening and hearing. I emphasize that difference because we have selective listening. So oftentimes we're in a conversation or we're in a group of people and we're aware of everything that's being said, right? We're hearing everything that's being said, and we might be selectively listening. Like I'm kind of listening, like on a low level of activity. It's an active cognitive process, but I'm not really paying too much attention to it. But when someone says something that catches my attention, now I'm going to pay attention to it, right? So look at that slide 3. This is a more detailed, more comprehensive definition of listening, which is the dynamic, interdependent, and uniquely human process of signaling attention, affection, empathy, understanding, and responsiveness through a vast repertoire of behaviors. So that's a lot, right? There's all types of communication and human communication behaviors that are part and parcel to listening. And so that's what it is. That's the detailed definition that I'm referring to. Oftentimes, I mean, here's the thing: when we're listening really well, it's great, right? If I'm listening to someone and I'm paying attention and I know that they're being heard and they perceive that I'm hearing them and listening to them and the conversation's great. But that doesn't always happen. Oftentimes there are listening barriers. So I want to go over a few listening barriers. One is self. So we have we're on slide 4. So our own self is ourselves are what keep us from listening well. It's a barrier to being an effective listener. So we have self-focus, emotional noise, and criticism. Self-focus is I might be listening to a conversation. I'll just like say me and you, right? So I might be listening to you, but if I'm just too focused on myself, I'm too concerned about myself, it's going to be hard. It's going to be more challenging for me to be giving you all the attention that you need during this cognitive active process because I'm just thinking about myself. Maybe I'm in a hurry or I got something to do or I'm hungry or I'm more concerned about my needs or you're talking to me about a challenging relationship. And as you're talking to me about your relationship, I start thinking about my relationship. And I'm like, well, I want to talk about my relationship. And it's like, well, maybe that's a normal human response, but the fact of the matter is that self-focus is a barrier for me listening well to you. Emotional noise would be, I could be in a good mood and a bad mood. I could be angry, sad, tired. There's all kinds of tired is more like physiological. It's more like just a physical thing, but nevertheless, like if there are a variety of emotions that are competing for your attention, or I have emotions that are competing for your attention, that's going to keep me from listening well. Maybe I'm in a great mood. Maybe I'm really happy and excited about something that just happened. I'm having a great day, but I just start thinking of all these like cool things because I'm so excited, and as a result, I'm not being a good listener. And then there's criticism, where I might just be criticizing you based on what you're telling me. Maybe you're having a conversation with me. You're telling me, you're saying like, hey, I need to talk to you. I'm like, oh, okay. What do you got to say? And as you're talking to me, I'm listening, and then I start judging you. I'm thinking, man, we've had this conversation so many times, or you made the same mistake again with the same person. You're repeating the same cycle. And I might be thinking to myself, man, he's never going to get it. She's never going to get it. Like as I'm doing that, I'm criticizing you, but simultaneously that's keeping me from being an effective listener, because part of being an effective listener in most situations is that I'm going to be supportive, or at least that's the way I'm describing it from the perspective of this chapter, and especially from the perspective of most listening scholars. So those are some of the self barriers, and then there's information processing barriers, which are, excuse me, processing rate, information overload, and receiver apprehension. So processing rate is basically the degree to which we get the spare brain time. This is like basically related to why I always say on these PowerPoint videos, I say try listening to this at a higher rate, at 1.5 or 1.75 or 2.0, whatever you're able to focus. And I say that because as you listen to different videos, like whether it's for me or other professors or just other videos on YouTube or other channels, apps or whatever, you can still pay attention. You still know what the person's saying. You can follow along no problem when they're speaking really fast because your brain can process information very quickly. And I don't recall the exact numbers, but the average person might speak around, let's say, 200 words per minute, and then the average person can process, let's say, 400 words per minute. And different textbooks and different scholars have different numbers, and then the exact numbers aren't imperative in terms of the exact numbers of how many words that we can process per minute versus how many words that we can speak per minute. The bottom line is the takeaway is our brains are capable of processing our brains can process words much more quickly than we typically hear them. So that's what creates spare brain time, as I call it, spare brain time. So I'm listening to you, but maybe you're speaking too slow. Or bottom line is my brain is processing way more quickly than you're speaking. So then I start thinking of other things. I start thinking about what I want to make for dinner, or I start thinking about um, whatever. I just get bored. I get tired. Maybe I get impatient. So it's kind of related to self focus, but more more specifically, like this is the processing rate. The reason why you get that spare brain time and you're like paying attention to the person, but you're like thinking of all these other things, is because of that processing rate. That can be a barrier. And then there's information overload, which is you're talking to me and it's just so much information, and I'm this is something that you've been dealing with for weeks or months or years, and you're finally like telling me about it. You've been thinking about this for so long, and you're just dumping it. You're just like downloading all this information onto my hard drive, so to speak, and it's just like, whoa, it's so much information, and it's hard to process. It's hard to process all this information. So it's real, thick and meaty and chewy, and it takes me a while to get through it all, to use a food metaphor. So that can be a barrier for me to be an effective listener. And then there's receiver apprehension barrier. It's basically like you're giving along those same lines of information overload. I might have apprehension as the receiver of this message, as the person that you're talking to. I'm the one who's being the sounding board, and I'm processing all this information, and I might just have a lot of anxiety or apprehension about what to say. What do I say to this person? They're coming to me for advice. This is a big deal. This you might be talking to me about a conversation that the conversation that we might be having might have to do with you quitting your job, accepting a job, moving across country, ending a relationship, starting a relationship. These might be big decisions, and you're coming to me, so I might get this like this apprehension of like, oh gosh, like I don't want to say the wrong thing. But I'm your friend, or you came to me for a particular reason, and I want to give you good information. I want to give you good feedback, but I might have that apprehension of like, oh gosh, I'm not sure how to respond. So those are some barriers that keep us from listening well. Here's an easy sort of mantra to think about on slide 6. An easy mantra to think about when it comes to being a good listener: stop, look, and listen. Right? Stop what you're doing. Like once I'm in a conversation with a person and I realize, oh, they need my attention, or they need me to be a good listener. We're not just talking about like what you had for lunch. What did you have for lunch? Hamburger. Oh, cool, great. I had a sandwich. Awesome. That's not a very significant conversation, right? It's not that important. But when it's an important conversation, I can just stop, like turn off all competing messages, put my phone away, turn the TV off. Let's go to a place where we can actually focus, and I can give you my undivided attention, and eliminate all distractions. Listen. The look part is like me looking at you, listening with your eyes. And that's not just me looking at your eyes, but I'm using my eyes. I'm looking at you. I'm engaging with you, and I'm also looking at your facial expressions, your nonverbal behaviors, and I'm just like taking it all in, right? Like what's going on with this person. Twiddling your thumbs, you might be stuttering, you might be shaky. I'm trying to like really like be a good listener by paying attention to everything that's going on, not just your eyes, but like everything that's going on. And then listening, which is understanding the details and ideas of whatever it is that you're telling me. So this is where it's like a very active cognitive process where I'm like processing. So it's not just a matter of like, it's not just a matter of um, like having an awareness of what the person is telling you, but I'm actually using my brain. I'm like thinking, I'm using visualization. Imagine if I said, hey, can you, do a math problem in your head, 3 + 2, and like, can you actually visualize like the number 3 plus the number 2, and then the equal sign, and then it's 5. Like our brains are very, very powerful. When I was for some reason, I really loved algebra when I was in college. And for funsies, I would oftentimes solve a quadratic formula. I would just solve it in my head. I'd see a math problem on my homework, and it was 3x plus or 3x squared plus 6x plus 3 equals something, and solve for x. I forget. It's been a really long time, right? So the way you do that, you'd work it out by hand, and you write out all these equations, and then you finally get the answer and you solve for it. But there's all these steps you have to take. But as a challenge for myself, I would do it in my head, but sometimes I'd close my eyes, or just kind of like look at the ceiling, or I would just really have to focus and use the power of my brain. I just did it to see if I could do it, and I started getting good at it. I would like see it, and I would process it, and I'd see all the steps and all the answers, and then I'd write them down, and then I would check my work. I'd look at the back of the book, and I'm like, oh, right, there we go, I did it. And I say that to illustrate the fact that like don't cop out and say like, oh man, I'm just not a good listener. Like, well, maybe you're not a good listener because you're not trying, right? Easier said than done, but part of being a really good listener is you have to like use the power of visualization. Someone's telling you all the details, and they say like, oh yeah, and then we went to a restaurant and it was raining on me. Well, picture a restaurant, picture the rain, like think about rain. You know what rain looks like. So like use the power of visualization to help you be a good listener, to help you like empathize and perspective take with that person. Easier said than done, and it's tiring. If you've ever been in a conversation where you serve as a listener and you would say like you did a pretty good job of listening, let's say it was a 20-30 minute conversation, you might be exhausted afterwards. It could be a very tiring process. Good, that means you were paying attention. That means you were doing the things that you should be doing to be a good listener. So I want to point out the different listening styles that the authors talk about. So they talk about relational, analytical, task, and critical. Basically, read up on those, and I recommend that you take the listening styles survey on your own and see what kind of listener you are. Slide 8 is from some research that I was working on with a listening scholar, and we were in our survey. We had all the participants in our survey. We had all the participants in our study take this listening style survey, and these have 6 items. The survey you see in our textbook, it each has 4 items, and then this is basically the same survey, but it's a little bit longer. But bottom line, I'm showing you this just to give you an idea of what each type of listening style looks like. These are the items that we would use to identify a person's listening style. But you don't need to know all the numbers. I just want to show you this for reference. Excuse me. So the whole field of listening scholarship is fairly new in terms of how it's evolved quite a bit in just the last maybe 15 to 20 years tops, which, it's for something like nonverbal communication. That's been around a much longer time, or competent communication, or let's say anger. There's all different types of human behaviors that have been studied for decades and decades, or maybe even hundreds of years, right? But the whole listening scholarship is fairly new in terms of new in our field of study. So a lot of people would think that your listening style is stable, irrespective of the situation. In other words, you're all whatever your listening style is. If you say you're an analytical listener, a task listener, a relational listener, or a critical listener, that means that you're like put into a box. You're always that way. Or in a similar, on a related note, you might take a survey and you're identified as being an introvert or an extrovert, and some people say like, well, you're an introvert, so that means in every situation you're going to be introverted. And what more recent research has found in the last couple decades is no, like, well, yeah, I might be primarily an introvert, but oftentimes I'm in a situation where the features of the situation, or the characteristics and features of the situation, and or the people in that particular context, um, basically produce within me a propensity for me to practice extroverted behaviors. That's kind of like me in particular, where I tend to be more to myself and more quiet, but I know how to turn it on. I know how to turn on that extroverted behavior when I need to. But it can be tiring. Whereas I can get worn out by it. Whereas other people say the exact opposite. I had a friend in my master's program, and she said, "Oh my gosh, I get so energized by being extroverted, by talking to people and doing all these things. Like, it just gives me so much energy." And I'm like, I'm the exact opposite. It absolutely drains my energy. But we're flexible as humans. We're flexible in the way that we exhibit certain behaviors. But we do have our primary styles, but we can adapt and be flexible based on the situation. So the answer is we change. So if you look at slide 10, you don't need to know all these details. This, again, was from some research I did where we were looking at patterns of conversations, and I'm not going to go into detail about the research, but we were looking at patterns of conversations that people had with other people. And the first thing we did for the participant, we said, "Hey, what's your primary listening style?" They took the survey, and then their primary listening style was, let's say task, and then there's the primary, and then the secondary one was analytical or something. And then we asked them to recall a recent conversation they had, and then they provided all these details about the conversation, and we asked like the way that they listened in that conversation, and they provided a response. And what we found is, oh wow, lots of people who identify as a primary listening style, they change their listening style based on the characteristics of the interaction, based on the goal of the listener in these narratives. Where, like, if my goal is just passing time, it might be different than if my goal were companionship or empathy. So there's so many different features and characteristics and details of conversations that can stimulate different types of listening dimensions. So there are several components of listening. And the first one being hearing. That's the first thing. The first step is hearing, right? We might be selective listening. You're in a crowded area, and the first thing you do is you hear something, and then you attend to something, right? So you hear, and then you attend, like you pay attention to, right? This is pretty straightforward. And then it's understanding, right? The next step would be understanding, like what's going on, like I'm trying to make sense out of the conversation, and then remembering, right? I hear what you're saying, and then I'm paying attention to what you're saying. I'm understanding what you're saying, and the way I'm understanding is by visualization, using that cognitive active process. But then I have to remember. I have to remember what you're saying, and it's easy to forget. And the thing is, if you recall, one of the details, one of the key features of communication is the consequentiality of communication. There's consequences for the things that there's consequences for how we communicate and how we fail to communicate. So if you forget something and then someone's having a conversation with you and they bring something up and they look at you and they're like, "Don't you remember? We had this conversation. I told you this last Friday. You remember? We were talking." "Yeah, I remember the conversation, but I don't remember that detail." Sure, we can't remember everything, but the more that we try, the more that we're practicing these like cognitive activities where we're like engaging in visualization and interrupting the person, asking for clarification, and so on and so forth, the more likely we are to remember. So paying attention, giving them your full undivided attention, we're more likely to remember. The consequences of forgetting is that it can hurt the person's feelings. It can make them feel like they were wasting their time. So those are things to keep in mind, right? Imagine if you came to me, let's say we're good friends, and you came to me and you wanted to talk to me about something that was of a sensitive matter, a very sensitive topic. You don't like talking about it, a relationship issue, right? and I said, "Yes, I'll listen." And then we're talking for a long time. And then at the end of the conversation, you look at me and you say, "So what do you think?" And if I'm going to be honest, I might say, "I'm really sorry. I completely was like not paying attention in the last 5 minutes of you talking. In all honesty, I was just thinking about food. And I mean that's a hypothetical, but it's probably not too far fetched. Chances are you'd be pissed, right? You're gonna be angry. You're gonna be upset. You're gonna be like, well, that sucks. Like, why would like how come you weren't paying attention, or how come you didn't just stop me and say like, oh hey, hold on a sec, start over. I didn't want to hurt your feelings. Well, now my feelings are hurt worse, right? So forgetting or not paying attention, not remembering could just make a bad situation worse. Bad situation, mean not a bad situation, but a vulnerable situation where you're opening up to me, and then you realize that I'm not paying attention to you and I'm forgetting things because I'm drifting off, or I'm looking at my phone, or I'm looking at the TV, or I'm just daydreaming. That can make you very upset and offended, and maybe even regret that you even told me. So I'm not trying to like scare you away from listening, but rather to equip you for how to be a good listener when you need to be a good listener. And then that last component is responding. So one of the things that aids in remembering is responding. So frequently, if I'm the listener and you're telling me a detailed story, and let's say we're talking for a while, I should be frequently stopping you, not like every 5 seconds, because that would be really weird. But I should be frequently stopping you. I'm trying to I'm tracking with you. I missed a detail here and there. Like so I'm paraphrasing. So you're saying that when you met with your boss said your performance has been subpar. Is that what you said? So, and then how did that make you feel? Right. So I'm going to try to fill in some missing details. Because for me, it's the first time I'm ever hearing this conversation, right? For me, it's the first time I'm ever hearing the details of the story. For you, you've been living it for days, weeks, months, or years. So there's all kinds of details involved, right? So I need to frequently respond to what you're saying and paraphrase and ensure that I have the accuracy of the details of what you're telling me. That's how you be a good listener. That's why a conversation can take a really long time. Try it out. So, according to Bodie et al means and others, in case you didn't know, you know. This and a lot of the research that Bodie has done on listening, they have found that good listeners do a variety of things. They ask and answer questions, they provide relevant and reflective feedback, they offer their own perspective, and then they respond non-verbally by engaging in appropriate eye behavior, nodding their heads, and leaning forward. Now, given that, it could be tempting to just fake authentic listening. So these things are like responding non-verbally, nodding their heads, saying things like "uh-huh," "mm-hmm," that must be difficult. I'm sorry that you went through that. Oh, that must be so tough. I'm making all the facial expressions, the sighs, the grunts. That's called back channel responses, back channeling. And sometimes, one that I've heard before that can be frustrating is like, "Oh yeah," and it's like the tone of voice that a tone of voice that's responding to something I said that doesn't match up. So sometimes you hear someone respond to what you're saying, and all of a sudden you realize, wait, that's not a logical response. That makes me think you're not really paying attention. You're just kind of going through the motions, right? And that's often what's happening. It doesn't always mean that's what's happening, but it often means that's what's happening. Because like, if you're telling me all these details of the story and I'm responding in a way that just doesn't match up, like if I said, "Oh, really?" when I should have said, "What?" You're like, "Wait a minute, like something's off." Like you know the right responses non-verbally based upon what you're telling me, because you're the one who's disclosing that information. So when you do these things, the idea is you do them authentically, that you provide reflective and relevant feedback, that you respond non-verbally in logical, appropriate ways. And part of this is also called immediacy, right? So we talked about immediacy behaviors in the chapter on nonverbal communication. So practicing immediacy behaviors, this is an example, a specific context of how you can practice immediacy behaviors. So that's what good listeners do, according to research. So like I said, take that listening, last slide 17, take the listening style and then try to, or even if you don't take the survey event, even if you don't fill out the survey in your textbook, at least read through all the different responses, read through the different items, the different descriptions of each style, and then try to ask yourself, like, which primary style seems to characterize you? What's the way that you typically listen? And then I would say, for your own benefit, because one of the reasons why you're taking this class is to become a better communicator. Obviously, it's a required course that you're taking. But hopefully, like, one of the things that you take away from the course is that you're a more effective, a more competent communicator. And then specifically with regards to this chapter, a better, more competent listener. So in light of that, take a couple minutes and write down some of your own listening barriers. In other words, what prevents you from listening well? And you can just do this all on your own, but like think of this as like a journal, not a diary, like this is what I did today, but a journal, like a journal of self-reflection. How do we become a better person in this one area called listening? Be honest. What do you typically do? What prevents you from listening well? What are some of the barriers that you face, the distraction that you engage in, right? Be honest. Identify those. Write them out. And then, what are at least 2 things that you can do to listen more effectively? At least 2, if not more. What are a couple things that you can do to be a more effective listener? And then how do you plan to implement that into your daily conversations? Or let's just say one particular person, right? Maybe there's one particular person in your life, and that person, someone that you speak with on a regular basis. So how would you improve your listening? How would you improve your listening behaviors with that person? And maybe it's a conscious shift from one listening style to another listening style. Maybe you think, yeah, I'm more of a task listener, but with this person, it seems like I should be a relational listener. So look up the relational listening style and figure out how do I listen this way. It's not natural for me to listen this way. So how do I listen this way? For me personally, I oftentimes tend to be more of the critical listener, which doesn't necessarily mean that I'm criticizing someone, but read up on what critical listener is. It's basically catching errors and inconsistencies. It's one thing to be aware of the errors and inconsistencies. It's another thing to point them out. I don't always point them out. I try not to, especially if it's not relevant. I don't want to point out someone's inconsistencies and errors just for the sake of doing it, but I'm consciously aware of it. So if your listening style doesn't match up with someone like a friend or a roommate or a coworker, figure out at least 2 things that you can do to be a more effective listener. So I've given you enough information on how to be a good listener. Hopefully, please implement it. These things matter. And hope you're all doing well. Talk to you later.